All right, welcome everybody to another class here at Fossil Creek Nursery. My name is Hunter, and we are going to talk about drip systems today. So, just starting out, what is a drip system? So, drip system is a more efficient way to water gardens, trees, really anything, containers that you are looking to, keep alive this summer because it is hot. Right now, it's about 98 degrees on average. So here in Colorado, it's pretty brutal. Um, Drip systems are great because, like I said, it's an efficient way to water plants. It's more targeted and also gets in more even or spread of the water in your garden. Compared to sprinklers, drip systems are 90% efficient, whereas sprinklers are 50 to 70% as efficient. And because the drips are so efficient, you can actually get an exemption for water restrictions from your local state government, which is really helpful, especially in places like Colorado where there are a lot of water restrictions. Um, One thing that's good about the drip system versus a sprinkler also is harder places to hit with the sprinklers, such as corners of the house or a special side of a tree that might be blocking your garden. That's going to not be restricted by drip because it's going to be targeted. Another thing with drip systems is it prevents fungal rot or also disease and bacteria. And that's because when you're using an overhead sprinkler, you're getting the entire plant wet. And so we know from our last pathology one that dry plants or wet plants with no airflow that stay constantly wet will promote powdery mildew, downy mildew, botrytis, all the different bacterias, the lilac bacterial rot. So we don't want to do that. Another thing that's great is you don't have to hand water. Drip systems are very easy to use. You can set them up on automated timers, and just it's an easy way for people who are busy. It doesn't take a whole lot of time. Um, so some of the advantages that we'll go over: low volume application of water, basically meaning a slow drip of water is going to more evenly water your garden, your pots, your raised beds. And that's because you're lessening the amount of runoff that is happening. So if you take a sprinkler and you're hitting one spot consistently with a lot of water at once, you can even see it for yourself that there's some water that's going to run off. It's going to puddle. It's not going to evenly spread across a certain area. If you're watering a bigger raised bed, you're only going to get a targeted spot and you're going to get a lot of runoff. Another thing that's good about the low volume application is you're getting a better ratio of air to water in your soil. I won't get too deep into it, but porosity is the balance of air and water. You want about 60% water to 40% porosity. So you're basically the space between the soil particles that is not necessarily dry, but it's not soaked. Um, so, like I said earlier, the sprinklers also, beyond hand watering, is going to be more unequal. Runoff leaching will be more of a play in with that one. Like I said, it can be automated. There's a lot of ways to do the automation. You can have timers that you can buy just from like an Ace Hardware or a Home Depot, even um, that it's just a cheap piece of plastic. Basically, that's kind of your low end. If you want to start getting more in depth, you could get a water control, or if you have multiple zones, you can have automated zone control. So you're getting different amounts of water to different parts of your garden. And I'll go into that a little bit more later on. And then the last real advantage of drip systems is they are pretty adaptable and you can change it fairly easily. Like I said, I'll go into more about the emitters, but if say you're switching up your garden year to year, you can change the placement of your emitters pretty easily. Um, Drip systems are it's a simple way to do it. And the other thing is you don't have to dig trenches or have hooked up to a proper water line. You can use drip systems plugged into anything like a faucet, your water spigot, or even if you've got ponds or a water source that's available to you, you can use pumps to carry that water throughout. So, talked about the advantages. I'm going to talk a little bit about some disadvantages. There's not a whole lot to disadvantage as long as you're keeping up with regular maintenance, watching out for clogs, cut lines, things like that. Um, when you're getting clogs out of your drip system, it's about a once a year thing. Really, it's about flushing out the system at the beginning of the growing season. So, March, April, whenever you're getting your plants in the ground, greenhouse, doing inside, you're going to want to flush out that system. You don't really have to use any kind of product or whatnot. You just want to run the system, for an hour or so. Just get all the particulate, all the stuff up that may have accumulated over the winter time. If you're doing fertigation, which is a more kind of advanced way of doing drip systems, it's really common in bigger operations where it's harder to fertilize, over a large scale of plants. But fertigation is essentially having a hookup for liquid fertilizer that pumps directly through your drip system. So you're irrigating and fertilizing at the same time, hence the name fertigation, right? So with that brings up issues, especially if you're using salt-based fertilizers. Salt-based fertilizers will eventually build up. It's kind of the same as a calcium buildup on your shower head or on your faucet in the kitchen. CLR, easy to fix that. But like I said, fertigation is something you might see in a larger scale. If we're doing our home gardens, it's much more easy and practical, really, to just do either have your extended release products or do the liquid fertilization, just yourself. You're doing it every other week or so. So having a small scale is not as hard to properly cover, if you will. All right. So really for disadvantages, that's about it. So really it's just the maintenance of it, staying on top of it. You know, if you got a cut in your line or you got an emitter that might have, popped out, um, easy fixes. And it's usually drip systems don't cost a whole lot to set up. So moving on, talk about the placement of your emitters and your drip system, kind of a preview of how to set it up. You're going to want to have those emitters as close to the root zone as possible, especially on newly planted perennial shrubs, trees, anything like that. You want to have that emitter right on that root ball. For perennials, you don't really later on, as they get larger, you don't really have to move the emitters, but things that are larger, like a big shrub or a tree or an evergreen, you're gonna progressively spread the where the emitter is hitting. With trees, you want that emitter to be on the drip line or the circumference, basically, of the canopy of the tree. That's where your most fibrous roots are, so that's where you want to water. Those are the roots that are going to end up taking the most water up, and that's because the smaller roots with multitudes of them is going to have a higher surface area than your big roots that are right near the root ball. And we're talking about a more mature tree. Shrubs, kind of the same thing, but it's going to be less exaggerated of a progressive, making the drip line bigger, essentially. The other thing to think about with placement is the kind of soil you are dealing with. So clay, by its nature, um, has more holding capacity for water. So you're going to actually want to spread out those emitters a little bit more than, say, if you were in sand. The clay, like I said, it's going to hold water more efficiently than something like sand or loam. So you're going to actually want to spread those emitters out about 2 feet from each other. This isn't a perfect exact science, and obviously, if you're planting smaller things that are closer together, you're going to want to get that water to the root zone. But just as a general rule of thumb, you want to have a wider berth between the two emitters in the clay. So, for example, sand is going to be about half that. You'll have about 12 inches between your emitters and the sand. And for another example, if you've got a large tree in the clay and you want to get your emitter on both sides, you're going to have probably 2 to 3 emitters to cover that root zone. When you've got the sand, because you want it closer together, because the sand drains more, you're going to lose more water because of that. So you're going to probably have 3 to 4 emitters hitting one tree. Um, like I said, it's not an exact science, and it's a very adaptable thing because plants are different sizes and they're going to need different water requirements, of course, too. So just always keep that in mind. But kind of the general rule of thumb is have a good spacing out. And so we talked about the emitters just now. We're going to go in a little bit more in depth of the types of emitters that you use. So there are just regular drip emitters, which are going to be very small amount of water. We're talking about 1 to 5 gallons per hour. There are ones that are a little bit more, but then when we get into that kind of category, it's more called a bubbler. Um, Bubblers are actually what I use in my home garden. It is essentially spouts water out like an umbrella, whereas the drip is just a single drip. This one is going into a circle. This is good for big vegetables. I use it in my vegetable garden. It's good for new shrubs because you're getting good water on them. Um, so you're getting a more area of coverage essentially. One that isn't commonly used, but I do want to mention it, is micro sprays, which are essentially it's a mister, not quite like a fogger that's going to be very, very fine particulate, but it's going to be more like a mist. So these have a much higher output rate, so they're not technically an efficient use of water. So the bubblers use around 10 to 15 gallons per hour. For an example, the micro sprays are going to be 30 plus gallons an hour. They do cover a larger area, but because it's mist, it is subject to things like wind, which other drips are not really, doesn't really affect them. And then just a little more about setup. Like I said, you can just hook it up to a hose spigot. That's the way I do it at home. It's pretty simple. The way you set it up is you'll have the spigot. Connected to the spigot is going to be your timer, and then you'll have a pressure flow in the filter for particulates in that. And I do have a small little example picture at the end of this class, so you can get a better idea instead of me just explaining it and you try and visualize it, right? So, like I said, with the backflow filter, basically what that is if you're on a farm, if you're using well water or non-potable water, the backflow stops the water from going back into, say, something like household water that you're using for dishes or brushing your teeth, things like that. You don't want that water to get into your main system. The filter is going to both prevent particulate into getting into your drip lines, which is going to cause clogs and things like that, but it's also going to stop things with the backflow filter from getting into your household water that you don't want to be contaminated. The mesh filters for municipal water, so if you're using water here in town in Fort Collins, you're hooked up directly to the water lines, you're going to just need about 150 to 200 mesh filter. The ratings are on the filters, so it's pretty easy to figure it out. Nothing, you don't have to do any math or anything like that. And that's for municipal water. So we're talking about water that is potable. We're not as worried about getting contaminated water into our household water. It did say a little bit about this earlier, but the different emitters for different plant size. So the emitters are going to be, if we're using something that's like a 1 to 5 gallon per hour emitter, something that's bigger, you're probably going to want to use the 5 gallon per hour. If we're talking about a small perennial or annual, it's about, a gallon per hour. And that's, and those are actually marked by different colors of the emitters, so it's easy to tell. Some companies have uh, different colors for the amount of emitting that they do. So buying from the same company is kind of the easiest, simplest way to do it. So everybody's favorite thing to do is a little bit of math. So if you are curious to see how much gallons per hour that you are using, it's a fairly simple math equation that you can look up. But as you can see, so it's the bucket size divided by the seconds to fill, and then you see times 3,600 seconds in an hour, and that's going to be your flow in gallons per hour. And I'll put that up for Instagram to see also. Can definitely look this up on Google instead of having to copy this down. But just so you know, there is a way to figure it out if you're not quite sure. And then just the final thing, operating the system, meaning about automation or timers and things. I touched on this, but I just want to go in a little bit more detail about it. The basic timer, like I said, it's just a spin dial that you have to do by hand. Cheapest and easiest way to do it. It's how I do it at home, just because I'm really running for just one zone. If I'm talking about doing landscaping on a larger scale, you have your front garden, back garden, vegetable garden, things like that. We're talking about multiple zones. Then you're going to want to do something like the Rainbird, which is a whole dashboard control. They have smaller ones, so you don't have to get, the commercial size, but those are going to be the way to control different zones, different flows, all that, the timing of it. So yeah, that's the operating. And um, there's no perfect amount to say. All the plants are different. So just a general rule of thumb, smaller perennials are going to be like 1 to 4 gallons a week of water. Bigger shrubs, like in number five pots, the shrubs that we sell here specifically at Fossil Creek are in number fives. Those are going to be about 4 to 6 gallons per week. So those are going to be smaller end of shrubs. The big shrubs, we're talking more 6+ gallons per hour or gallons per week, sorry. And then trees, it's about 10 gallons per inch of caliper per week. And all this is sourced from Colorado State University's extension. So this is specifically for Colorado, really even specifically for the Front Range where it's dry. We're a semi-arid at elevation, so it's more rough on plants. We don't get a whole lot of water and water in the form of rain. So that's why we're watering quite a bit. Um, you might see some other information that might be for the East Coast, and it's only saying 3 gallons per week. The best thing to do, I'll say about that, is just check out what area of the country they are talking about for a certain plant, because it can be vastly different here in Colorado. We have a very unique growing area because of that semi-arid climate plus being at elevation. So some of the stuff that may apply to other parts of the country do not apply here. And that's just a fair warning, because you can get some information that might be conflicting. Best way to do it is look up CSU's extension. They've got great information if you want to get a little bit deeper into the watering. And then, so just for the last thing, I got a little example here of some different drip systems. So we'll show it here on Facebook first. You'll see where the emitters are going to be right on to where the root zone of the plant is. There's a few different ways that you can do it with, this would be more like a way for bubblers. And then this is just a basic emitter. And then this down here is going to be how you would set up if you had containers or smaller projects like that. So here's for Instagram. The one in the middle is going to be more like a bubbler. This is how how I do it at home. And then these ones, you can see the emitters are going to be right at where the root zone is. And then these are for containers and smaller projects. Cool. So that about wraps it up. If we got any questions, I can answer those real quick. So I see one about hard water. So that's going to be something you're going to worry about with build up on the emitters. It's essentially the same with something like a shower where you're going to get that calcium buildup, salt buildup. Um, the best way to go about it is having that filter. And then if you really see a big clog, using CLR. The drip system that I'm currently using is has I've had it for I think 3 years now, and I have had minimal problems with hard water. Um, with that being a buildup, one way to completely um, get around having the hard water is get a reverse osmosis filter. We're starting to get a little more pricey, but this is something that's basically going to make distilled water. Distilled water is actually one of the best things that you can use to water plants for because there is no extra mineral content or any kind of nutritional value for it. So when you're fertilizing, you're getting a more exact count. And let's see what. So I see one mulch on top of soaker. Yes, definitely. I actually kind of skipped over that, so thank you for reminding me. It is always a great idea to have mulch no matter what, and that's just because it's going to keep your root zone cooler, and it's also going to keep be more efficient in your water use because of that reason. Drip systems are there's many different ways that they are made. There's ones that are drip tape that isn't quite as flexible. The one I have at my house is a basically it's a plastic flexible tube that you would maybe see in like a I'm trying to think maybe like a what do you call it? A camelback. I'm like, what is it called again? Yeah, so it kind of looks like a camelback. All right, going down. Mhm. I'm not sure about Arkansas. This is really specifically for Colorado, so I wouldn't be able to really answer that correctly. And so I'm going to put up the example one more time, real quick. Oops, sorry. And like I said, the one in the middle is how I do my drip system at home, which is going to be the bubbler type. These ones are going to be kind of your more basic emitters. And I'll do that for Instagram too. Like the middle, it's going to be the bubblers, kind of your basic setup. Cool. Let's see if we can. Yeah, we can definitely do another class. We're always looking for good class ideas, so we could probably definitely set that up. It would probably be next month, for a little more advanced, but I could totally set that up. So watering every day is something you want to avoid. That is because keeping the ground soaked constantly is going to be something that promotes your rot and your fungal issues. Root rot will be something that comes into play. Also, another thing with watering every day is fungus gnats and other larva type insects that mosquitoes, things like that, they like to grow and lay their eggs in that moist soil. Fungus gnats feed on your roots also as larvae, so that is definitely something that is very detrimental. So watering more like 1 to 2 times a week is how we recommend. Right now, it's really hot, so on these hot days, you can kind of tell by the wilting. But for example, I water 3 to 4 times per week in my garden at in July specifically. Once it gets cooler, you can tone it back. When I'm saying cooler, I'm saying in the 80s down to the 70s. But when it's pushing 100 degrees every day, you're gonna be watering quite more often. Cool. Any more questions? All right. It looks like we're good. Thanks, guys, for coming. And look for a 102 class on drips. We'll get into a little bit more on that.